Welcome back to the Global Landscapes Forum Day 2 here in Bonn, where we're focusing on rights in the landscape. And this evening, I have with me George Marshall, who is an environmental campaigner, communications specialist, and writer, and he's also the founder of Climate Outreach. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I understand you've written a book about why our brains are wired to ignore climate change. And I know it was a while ago, about 5 years ago. Are we still ignoring it?
Well, we're not paying very good attention to it.
Okay.
I think that there are some things we're good at paying attention to, and there's some things we're not so good at paying attention to. Things that we are wired to pay attention to are things where it's here, it's now, we have very clear enemies, there's a very immediate threat, okay? So clearly climate change is a bit challenging because, I think the big problem is because there's no enemy, right? So that's in a way where we respond very fast to something where somebody wants to cause us harm. But we're all involved in climate change. It's a very unusual issue, and that there's no external face of it. We are all in various ways implicitly involved with it. And I think this is a big reason why we tend to push it away and we find it hard to deal with. However, it used to be that people would say, yeah, that's something in the future, I'll be dead before that happens. The big shift that we are seeing right now is that it's getting more and more real for people. So psychologists would say the salience of it is getting greater. And we're seeing this now sustained in surveys and polling around the world, that more and more people are saying, yes, it's here and it's now. So we're part of the way towards overcoming people's resistance. We've still, though, got a very, very long way to go. The ultimate measure of this is the degree to which people talk about it with their family and friends. We know people still talk about it very little. The degree to which, if people are asked what are the main things that you're voting on, for example, voting preferences, or what are the main things in what you're making decisions in your life, climate change for most people simply doesn't figure there. So, it's unfortunately, the process of change still appears to be longer than the amount of time that we have to make that change. That being said, there is a change happening.
But in terms of young people, was your research based on did you base it on, because that's different, right? Like it seems like they're on board, completely on board.
Well, always the thing if we're looking at the research is, well, interrogate the research and say, well, who is saying what?
Yeah.
And that's where you find the differences. So you're absolutely right. Young people, there is a major generational shift, which tends to happen under 25, all right? So these are people who've grown up with it and are much more alert to it. They're far more concerned. They aren't always more engaged, though. We've seen a major, major shift, which I believe is a step change, which has happened over the past 6 months or so. I think that really is a change, but up until that point, young people would say they're very concerned, but they would kind of like roll their eyes and just go, yeah, well, I just feel powerless. I don't like to think about it.
Yeah.
So I think there's been a significant shift in their sense of power for some young people. But again, I'm afraid, just let's not underestimate how a lot of people are not involved with this. There is a strong, hard core of very vocal activists in some countries now.
Right.
There are other countries where there's hardly any discussion happening, right? But you're right for the young people. And this cuts across, the other big division is between left and right, where politics is in all the countries a determinant of attitudes on climate change, and in some countries an extreme determinant. I mean, of course, at its most extreme in the US, climate change is more politically divided than any other issue. It's more divided in gun control or abortion or any of these issues. It's extremely polarized. Young people cut through that polarization, so young conservatives are far more likely to be engaged with it. So there's no question that young people, I think, are the hope on this. And
and leading the way, I guess, even changing our mindsets, helping change them.
Well, totally. And, I've been working on climate activism now for 30 years. When I started doing this work, it was very, very hard to get anybody engaged with this issue.
I can imagine.
We tried very, very hard, and everything builds on the last thing you do, but it's been a long, long struggle to get people involved. But I think we're really now accelerating.
Great. So, and what can the media do to inspire people more to switch more to sustainable behaviors?
I think the media, first of all, have to recognise that climate change is a challenge for the media the same way it is for everybody. It doesn't fit well with a rolling news agenda, right? So the media, like our brains, respond very well to things which is here, which is now, which is threatening, which has an enemy.
Right.
And so long-term, progressive, steady issues are hard for the media to deal with. So the media has to make a very deliberate, strategic decision that they will cover this, and that they will, and they're going to monitor. They have to monitor their performance on it, because otherwise it just completely slips off, which is what's happened for the last 30 years. I think the media has to be doing much more to cover weather events as indicative. And I think that the media has to be recognizing that climate change is not an environmental issue. So at the moment it turns up in some corner by the environment correspondent, right?
Yeah.
It's not an environmental issue, it's an economic issue, a security issue.
Humanitarian
It
issue.
covers every area,
Yeah.
and that is why within the media every part of journalism needs to be actively engaged with this. It is a huge issue for finance, for example. It's a huge issue for property owners. It's a huge issue, a massive issue for security, which is why, the Pentagon has always had this flagged up as one of the biggest long-term threats. And in terms of personal behaviors, I would like the conversation not to be happening through the media so much. I think the place for a conversation about personal behaviors is actually through social networks. For example, through community networks or faith networks. Around 2000, there was a lot of things where, you'd have something in a magazine or a lifestyle magazine. Hey, here's 10 easy things you can do to save the planet. None of that actually made any difference.
Right.
It created a kind of a background noise, which is okay, it creates some awareness, but it actually didn't produce measurable behavioral change. We know that where behavior change really starts to come in is where people internalize their behaviors as part of their values of who they are.
Right.
And that's much more of a social process.
Yes, very true.
And when we could deal with the easier behaviors, like, I don't know, turning off the light or these things, but actually, of course, they're easy because they don't have a lot of impact. Where we get the really tricky ones, which is the food you eat, the amount you fly, the choice of the size of house you want to live in, or even where you live, which is probably the most important behavior, like the choices you make about your personal location, which determines how much energy you use, how much you drive, and so on. Well, that has to be embedded in people's entire approach to life.
Right, very true.
Yeah.
And I know we mentioned, it's the environment, touches on, business, finance, but also humanitarian. It's a humanitarian issue, what we're focusing here at the GLF, the
Yes.
rights, related to landscape.
Yes.
Which needs to be more in the forefront of the conversation.
Well,
What's your...
I think that knowing and understanding and being informed on climate change is a fundamental right. I think it's a moral right that people have a right to know about something which is going to affect and impact their entire lives. I think that's essential too, because people are not going to make good choices in terms of their personal or voting behaviours unless they're not going to give the social sanction for hard policies unless they understand it.
Yeah.
But it's also a legal right. It's enshrined in international law, and the International Convention on Climate Change and the Paris Agreement both have very, very clear clauses that require signatory countries to invest in educating and informing the people.
Right.
And every government in the world has broken that commitment and have failed to do it. So I think at all levels, I think it is entirely appropriate to place climate change within the language of rights. And I think talking about landscape is also entirely appropriate. Landscape in the sense of people's identification of place is extremely important because this cuts. The key issue of climate change is not that it should be about, about the economy or about your money. It's about identity.
Right.
It's about who you are. So if your identity is embedded in place, how climate change affects that place is fundamental to who you are. And similarly, in my work as a communications specialist, I would say you can't talk about climate change as, facts and figures and here's a great big graph, because that doesn't work for people. What works for people is talking about who they are, what's important to them, what they're proud of, and how climate change is going to affect the things that make them who they are.
So I think that's also part of this, in terms of media, like the communicating climate change stories. I think language needs to change too, because I think most people, when they hear climate change, it's more scientific related, so it's they just snooze. But we have to make climate change, a more sexy subject to get people awake. And I think the media has a big role to play in that, in changing sort of the narrative or the way we tell stories to get. Which I find there's a gap in that. We're not.
Yeah, I wouldn't use the word sexy.
Yeah, okay, not sexy. That's the wrong word to use, but just to make it more urgent. Appealing. Appealing is a good word. Let's use appealing.
I think there's lots of words there. I think relevant. I think appealing. I think relevant. I think authentic.
Right.
A lot of climate change communications is fundamentally inauthentic. It doesn't feel to people like it's really coming from a place that they can trust.
Right.
And that is part of the reason why a lot of people don't engage with it. They just feel, well, why are you telling me this? And have you got some interest in telling me this? I'm not quite sure what it is, but I don't trust you. And that's one of the things which creates this toxic political divisions we see. I think we need to be thinking of the media, for example, as a platform through which a much wider range of voices can express their attitudes and concerns. Yeah? Rather than as a place within which, I guess the difference is between communicate and engagement.
Right.
So we've been in broadcast communicate mode for 30 years now. Here is what the scientists are saying from the latest research, and this is what we, the experts, tell you to do. Now that's important because we need the science and we need the experts, but the engagement aspect is much more, what do you think? Let's hear your stories. How do you see yourself as being a part of this? Tell us what you think. Let's listen and let's reflect that back. We've had much too little of that.
Right, very true. And in terms of your latest research in in climate communication, who do you think we need to be talking to?
There are very large parts of the population that are being excluded from the conversation. To some degree self-excluded. To some degree they've just gone, oh, that's not my thing, I can't deal with that, it's not my business. Because it's not speaking to them in a way which seems relevant to them and their concerns. And some of it is about access to information, some of it is about power, some of it is about, let's face it, there's many people who are just struggling to get by with what they have, and quite reasonably, their biggest concerns will always be just getting by. In the developed countries, I would say that the richer countries in the world, I'd say the absolute priority is creating a conversation which reaches much wider than the kind of progressive liberal left side. And consistently, we've failed to reach across to people of more conservative values, people who might be more traditional in their outlook. They might be much more invested in talking about landscape. They might be much more invested in their place and their community. And that's where their primary focus is.
Right.
We need to be reaching out there. That includes, for example, farming is going to be devastated by climate change. Farmers should be completely actively engaged with preparing for this and responding to it and demanding government action, for example. And I think in less developed countries, I think there's an immense amount that can be done through faith networks.
Okay.
Right? So for many people, if you ask what's your core identity, it's not about nationhood, it's about their faith identity.
Right.
And so I would say we did a large project in India, for example. I'd say working through Hindu, but also Muslim networks in India, finding a way of converting the threat and the need for action into the language which speaks within their sacred texts and their faith tradition. Is a massive opportunity that's been scarcely explored.
Wow.
And both, and in particular, to some degree with Christians, but certainly for Hindus and Muslims, there's been far too little work because both of them have fantastic traditional teaching that can be drawn on to shape it. in terms of their identity.
Oh, that's really great insight.
Yeah.
So I guess my last question would be like, so what do we need to care more about? Well, I guess we've covered that this whole time. Actually, we have like mostly covered that.
To care more about. Who's the we? That's the question.
Well, I guess we as the world, as an audience, because I think like now it's all about like collaborating and coming together to figure out how we're going to tackle this climate crisis, rather than everyone competing and just thinking that we all live in our own little bubbles where we're all affecting each other, right? It's all.
I think this is exactly it. I think what we need to care more about is each other, and I think we need to care more about the people who are not currently part of it, but need to be.
Right.
In my own country, Britain, I would always say what we need to care more about are the people who are not currently part of that environmental bubble, and reaching out to them with respect and gratitude and saying we need to move forward on this and we need you, not just to be like us, but to be like you, but to be actively involved for everything you bring to bear. And I think the big hope of climate change is that facing this collective threat might be something that forces us to say, okay, you know what, we don't normally talk, but this is something we need to come together over. And we know that when people are forced to break through the barriers, they actually find they kind of like each other.
Right. Yeah.
So one of the things of climate change is we know, for example, when people have extreme weather events, repeatedly they come through it and they go, wow, you know what, I really got to love my neighbors and my community and these people I've never spoken to before, including people who normally would be nothing like you. Because you come together and you find actually that people are fundamentally good, help each other out, support each other. And that's the space, that's the positive side of climate change, is through this struggle I think we could get to a place where we discover our shared values and humanity.
That's fantastic. I think let's leave it on the positive note, right? Like, why not? Let's just do that, because we know we're in a crisis mode, but I like that we've left it on the positive note. Well, thank you so much for joining us.
You're very welcome. I
and
enjoyed
for your
that.
time. Yeah, me too. Thank you. Cheers.